So we have any number of questions from viewers who want to talk about gun safety issues, school hardening questions. We have a viewer from Clearbrook who wants the panel to discuss House File 1669 and 1605, but the viewer was kind enough to tell us what those are. Those are gun law bills presented by Linda Slocum, and that may help identify what the viewers' concerns are. Viewers' concerns about how you harden schools. Concerns about erosions to the Second Amendment. It's very difficult to sort of pull all that together to one topic, but I think if we can talk about that, maybe we can sort of break it down as we go along. Sure. You want to start with you, Senator Bigham?
Sure.
So.
I'm very proud of a bill that I am authoring with Republican Representative Keith Franke on threat assessment teams in schools. I think that this is a must-pass, must-sign bill this year. You think of the tragedy that happened down in Florida. One of the things that happened is the school had expelled the student and kind of there was no communication with local authorities and the FBI, and they each had some information, but nobody talked. And so being able to have that line of communication between the schools, local law enforcement, and prosecutors is, to me, key. And there's a few other states that have passed bills like this, and I think it's something that we should be taking a look at when looking at school safety. Look, the students that have come out on this topic are just simply amazing, and to not allow them to have hearings on bills that are so important to them is adverse to what we should be doing up at the Capitol. It's the people's house, and they deserve a voice. There's bipartisan bills that are going through that I know Senator Jensen's on that we should be having hearings on and should be passing. And I'm disappointed that, in my opinion, their voice is kind of being stifled by, I don't know what the fear is. I have a carry permit. I own firearms. I believe in the Second Amendment, but gun safety needs to happen. We can't have these mass shootings be the norm in our society. I refuse to let it happen, and I know there's a lot of those students and a lot of those young folks and adults that feel the same way. So I'm hoping that in the second half of session that we'll get hearings on these bills. As far as some of the bills that were mentioned there, I think we can find agreement on it. And like I said, we have bipartisan bills that talk about expanding criminal background checks, reporting stolen firearms. Keeping these guns out of from dangerous, bad people is something that everyone at this table agrees with. I know that. So we've got to be working on those types of issues.
Senator Jensen?
One of the things I've learned in my short 15 months there is oftentimes you'll sign on to a bill that you know isn't good enough. It's not ready for prime time. It's maybe the first step in a journey. And every piece of legislation that's put into play doesn't necessarily represent a destination. And I think you're absolutely right, Senator Bigham. There are two bills that I wanted to push along because I thought they got at the issue that I think most people can agree on. We should try to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have guns. And whether that's an illegal straw man purchase or whether it's trying to expand the use or the availability of background checks, because it's a useful tool. On the other hand, I'm not interested at all in infringing on our Second Amendment rights, and I think that I understand people's concern about, are we moving towards registration? I don't support that. Are we looking to sort of constrain and if you will, harness gun owners? I don't think so, because I think most gun owners, like you mentioned, Senator Bigham, are responsible gun owners, and if you pass a bunch of laws, the gun owners are the ones that are going to follow the laws. The criminals aren't going to. So I think we need to be careful, and sometimes what might seem like a perfectly natural thing to conclude, it doesn't necessarily stand up. One of the things would be the concept of a gun-free zone. I mean, we all feel better when we see a building says gun-free zone, maybe. But you know what? It's sort of an advertisement. This is the one place where you won't find a gun. So what do criminals do? They go to places where there are gun-free zones. So I think we need to be thoughtful whatever we do.
Representative Dean?
Well, I think what we saw in the last week where we had, unfortunately, another school shooting that was addressed very quickly by a school resource officer that was able to contain that, thankfully.
This was in Maryland, I believe.
Maryland,
right,
yes.
Yes.
And luckily, there wasn't more kids that were injured or killed. But I think that really shows that we can have effective protection for students within the building with school resource officers. That's important. Also, to be able to have them safer buildings so that they're easier to get out of and easier to protect. But then you have to step back and say, well, this hasn't been going on for 60 years. This is in the last 20 years that this has really become such an emergent problem for schools. And as a dad of a 9th grade girl who has to go to school every day, she worries about it. And I didn't worry about it when I was that age. You didn't worry about it when you were that age because it wasn't comprehensible. So I think that there's more at play than just gun legislation that says what's going on. And there's a lot of people, I think, that need to step up within our culture that says this is really a cultural problem that looks at why are kids doing this. You look at what are the social determinants of health, what are some of the social determinants of what's going on here. They tend to be boys. Why are boys in that age looking at mental health issues, looking at societal issues? How can this happen now where it didn't happen 25 years ago? And to kind of be real about what are really some of the causes of this and what are the root causes, and to have an honest conversation about that. And the way that I kind of test the waters on that is when you look at a school shooting or any mass tragedy like that, if my argument is exactly the same as it was before then, if I'm bringing the same argument forward, I'm probably not going to be as heard as well as if maybe I'm looking at it from a different point of view. So I'm really interested in trying to find some of those base issues of really what's going haywire with some of our kids in the schools.
Well, I'm hopeful, I don't want to jump in here, but I'm hopeful then that we can actually pass a bill that allows us to study this as a public health issue. And right now it's prohibited. So I hope that maybe that is one of the answers as well, so we can get at some of those issues that you're talking about, amongst other things. I mean, gun violence is a public health issue, and let's take a look at it, and maybe we can answer some of those questions.
Well, I appreciate your comments about having a conversation and that the bill isn't necessarily an end result, that it's a beginning place to have a conversation about different things. And because the question is about these two bills, I think that what's bothered me in my years in the legislature on this issue is the inability to really have an open conversation about what's going on. And in a sense, the two extreme points of view take over and prevent good dialogue about it. I remember an incident on the House floor. Maybe you remember this when Representative Mullery made the comment that when you hear when there are guns around and you hear the word duck, it means something different to different people. And I think that's true in our society, that we have a different idea about the use of guns and a different idea about the threat of guns. I think one of the issues for me is that the proliferation of gun ownership is a problem. I think there are just too many guns in our society, and it's increased over time. I'm not saying people shouldn't own guns necessarily, but I think when you have so many guns, you're going to have accidents. You're going to have more people who perhaps are not adequately trained, don't take seriously the weapon that they have, and also the types of weapons that are out there, which can really truly do extreme damage to someone who might get shot, whether it's an accident or on purpose or whatever. The other thing that concerns me, too, and has always concerned me, is the number of suicides that happen because of guns. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is a public health issue. I think it is a cultural issue. But we have to be willing to talk about maybe we've gone down the wrong path with assuring so much access to guns and defending that as an absolute right, when we need to have a conversation about how do we step back from that if we need to. I don't think other countries have the same problem we do with this particular tool. So that concerns me.
To that point, I think going back to what Representative Dean said makes a lot of sense. I think we want to look for common denominators, what's going on. I think mental health is clearly an issue. I think we're probably, in ways, as a society, we're probably a little crueler than we used to be. I think kids are cruel to one another. I don't know that they have the same skill sets. I think with all the technology, that may be making a big part of the problem. But I do think other industrialized nations have lots of shootings as well. And whether it's a knife or a gun or whatever, or even suicide. My brother committed suicide, and he did not use a gun, but for a period of time he had a gun. But he ended up jumping out of a building. But I do think that the root problem really is the mental health. And then I think it makes a lot of sense to try to harden targets, especially in schools. But obviously all the shootings aren't just happening in schools either.